Hello, John.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. It's good to see your face.
Good to see you. How are you, Doug?
I'm pretty relaxed at this point. It's been a
Great. Okay. We're expecting more people, right?
Yeah, we haven't heard from Ed today just yet, but I know he wanted to come. It was originally going to be between the two of you, and then a few others chimed in, like me and Geoffrey.
And we're recording?
Yeah, it's on auto record.
Okay. Cool. I just read your post, Doug. I loved what you said. And I was wondering how to start this event. Because many of us were going in many different directions. And I was wondering, so I thought the occasion of Jeremy's interview with Adam Robert on his new book on Gebser could be something that we could rally around. And because I think there's, many different bifurcation points. And there's also questions about ethics and art have been raised by Andrew. And I think Ed was interested in exploring ethics and aesthetics. So I hope when he joins us, we could get a clean start. Because what about you? Where would you like to start?
I would prefer a framing for this of some sort. And a clean start sounds perfectly fine with me.
Well, yeah. I want to get started, but I want other people to join us if they're going to join us. No one's fashionably late yet.
Right.
But I want to get started, but I don't want to start something that gets interrupted. This is, I guess, what asynchronous communications are all about. Okay, another voice. Great.
There's Ed.
Ed.
And, looks like Geoffrey is on the site, and he'll be on in just a few.
Okay. Hi, Ed. Welcome aboard. We were just thinking about what we wanted to do today and how we're going to frame this. And I just thought Jeremy's interview about his new book was really interesting. It could be something that we could all rally around. And I was also bringing up, before you came, talking to Doug about your questions about the ethics and the aesthetics. I think Andrew has been bringing that up, and you and Marco have been playing with that theme. And hi, Geoffrey, welcome.
Hi. All right.
And I have a lot of things I'm working on that could be of interest, maybe. I'd like to develop a little further. And I would like to maybe have a clean start. Where would you guys like to start? We've all looked at this interview, I gather.
Yep.
Yep. Many of us have made comments already in the forum. So I sort of want to weave together what's already happening in the forum.
Sure.
With what's happening, what could be happening here.
Sure. I liked your poem, Doug.
It was on the spot, and perhaps maybe some brief check-ins. I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, check-in would be good.
Letting others know where I'm at. But today or tonight marks the last of my transportations. I mentioned having help my family out by driving an hour here and an hour there in the morning and night for work purposes, and that will end. So that on top of the work requirements are slowly coming into place. So I feel, so that poem about a new skin, I feel
Could you
like
read the poem? Could you read it out loud?
If I can find it. It was kind of on the spot, so I don't have it memorized. But so old skin slowly shed out from body experience, leathery stray sprawled display like a tapestry, a quiet vocalization from a new silence location, anointed with new well-oiled skins, new transparent projections to wear, out-of-body experiences, new science, morphic resonances, social quantum mechanics, reimagining and reinventing the sacred. A lucid lectio, read, meditate, pray, contemplate, embody, a high astral wine from the divine, a new skin from within. So on the surface, that's me just saying, okay, I'm ready to move on from this hectic month and get somewhere. I've noted I've been reading quite a bit. I've been working on dream work and reading about astral projection, which I don't fully know where to be with that at this point. But it's perhaps a separate science from a new science that can be tested out. But there are varying perspectives on that. But before I go into that route, that's more of a personal, this is a personal introduction. So that's about where I am at this point. So.
You mentioned a title, I think, and a new skin from within. I like that. You mentioned a lucid lectio in your poem, and I like that. That's what I'm most attracted to.
Those were your words there. That's probably why you like them.
I also love
but
the
they're
idea.
not, they're our words.
Right.
Because you quoted them and used them in your poem. So it's sort of a meta poetry, I think you're creating. Or maybe what is a quantum poetics that's operating here?
I love the idea of writing a poem to mark a transition in mental, emotional states. It's such an interesting. I don't know if you do it all the time, but it's such an interesting process.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've written. I don't know if this is poetry, but that's how I can express thoughts onto page. So yeah.
So I've been sewing. It's a pair of pants I'm working on.
Are you taking them in or you're taking them out?
No, I'm creating them from scratch.
Oh, okay. This is a new garment. Okay, this is a garment.
Yeah, this is a garment that I'm creating. It's a pair of pants that has a slightly more feminine feel to it than traditional men's pants. So,
are you going to wear it? Is this your intention?
Yeah, yeah. So it's part of a collection that I'm developing on feminized masculine garments.
Ah, I like that. Ed, where would you like to start?
Well, John, as you so aptly put it in the forum thread at the beginning, and you're free to determine where that is.
There are almost too many directions that it all can take. But the ethics aesthetics, just what the hell is and where and what does any of that do? I'm quoting from you in the thread. Yeah. What does any of that have to do with integrality? integrality. You also mentioned current postmodern criticism of Gebser. So that's what that's sort of what's in my system right now. As this group grope towards something starts to emerge, I wanted to think about Geoffrey Edwards when he says God is queering humanity. And that's where I would like to go. What interests me, and I think you've mentioned already, Geoffrey, something about the garment that you're designing and the sort of play around the masculine and the feminine. So I want to start with a dream that I had. I guess this is my practice, lucid lectio divina. I was, it's a little complicated, my relationship to the 23rd Psalm. But I'm going to take a risk here. I'm sure everyone knows this, has heard this before. But I'm going to chant it. Sort of Cynthia Bourgeot, I believe her name, recommends that we use like a plain song. So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. Amen. So I was working with this in the middle of the night. And I did a few other exercises. And I was in bed and I entered into a sort of the zone. And I had some very interesting experiences. But I dwelt on that house of the Lord forever. That was the phrase. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And I just sort of kept recycling it as I was in this in-between space. I guess you could call it a sleeping wave function in that phase space where you're in a space of possibilities that later can get actualized. But it's in that in-between where we have those deviant logics, drawing upon some of Stuart Kaufman here. And also Kripal talks about being split beings, how we are all split in this way between the imagination and the real. And culture and myth, of course, draw upon these inherited stories and that have been circulated in Western civilization. And I believe we're starting to revisit some of these stories. And this is why I think the new wine, if you can't put new wine in old wine skins because it will split the wine skins. So I think that's the dilemma that I believe many of us are in as we've studied Kripal and Gebser, and some of us have studied Wilbur. William Irwin Thompson is another thinker. We've all been talking about different kinds of integralisms that are probably emerging through our different conversations. So this is what interests me. And I'm actually making attempts to resonate again with this old text, which comes from my childhood. I mean, I worked with this when I was very young. So there's an aspect of me that's still 10 or 11. I was starting in adolescence, where this story of David and Saul and Jonathan, right out of Samuel, and of course David is the poet singer who composed this song. So I think that's all circulating in my system. And I had a dream, a lucid dream. There was a prayer that I offered to this spectacular kind of space, which is neither here nor there, which is beyond, transcendent, and yet also immanent, because I had this intention that I want whatever happens to be shared with what I call the world. So there's an inside and an outside, or an interior and an exterior that's being addressed. And I felt a presence. It was located behind me. So I still had a sense of a human embodiment with a front and a back. And this had previously really frightened me when I felt presences that were invisible and behind me. And which is kind of odd, because I know I'm in these spaces I'm not seeing with my physical eyes anyway, but I still have a hangover from a physical experience. I'm sort of bringing that with me into these more subtle occasions. But I felt this energy behind me, and I moved it in front of me so I could gaze at him. And it was a male, very masculine presence. And we were eye to eye. He looked Semitic. His head was shaved. He had scars on his face and on his head. His body was he had a very powerful physique. And he was naked. And I felt an erotic charge. I am the body electric. And I could feel this flow. And I could also feel this incredible intensity. And I also noticed, to my surprise, that we were in a sort of a contemporary space. I could feel there was a kitchen. Felt like we were in a living room. We were on a couch. And then I noticed that he had a basket. And he offered me this basket, and in the basket were some cupcakes. And I could see on the top of the cupcakes there was dark chocolate. And he said something about tasting the dark chocolate. And I was like, I could feel my subtle senses, that subtle sense of taste. I was really anticipating what it would be like to taste this cosmic dark chocolate. And as I felt this attractor moving towards it, it all faded away. And I came back into the basic physical dimension in my bed in Manhattan, but with that anticipation of tasting that dark chocolate and what that would be like. So this is sort of my effort to a lucid lectio divina would be something that has been practiced in congregations, throughout Christendom, in monastic traditions. Persons got together and they chose a bit of a scripture and they resonated with it in silence together. They could do this individually. They could also do it as a group. So I'm sort of playing with the idea, and I think connecting this with Gebser. I think Gebser may have a different kind of take than I do on the Bible and the Old Testament. And I think that he would be fine with that, actually, but I may be wrong. He died in the early 70s, a few years after the Stonewall riots happened in Manhattan, which was the rallying, a pivotal point in gay culture, the emergence of gay culture on a world stage. So I'm just bringing all that together, hoping this may be of use to the group as we move through these first-person accounts with second and third persons, and how we can coordinate these first-person, second-person, third-person accounts, and what this could possibly mean as we may possibly be moving towards a third order out of the chaos of this second order, which many of us are tuning into. These these conflicts that are getting, and these binaries which have been around for generations, are getting amplified in a way that with enormous power through this technology. And how can we self-correct? How can we learn how to catch each other's rhythms rather than just be manipulated by algorithms? So anyway, that's the challenge, and I think this is a theme that we've visited often, and I'm just sort of playing this out in this public space, seeking some support, and definitely wanting to give support. Whatever is going on with your process and how you're working with Jeremy's take on Gebser. I've not read the book yet, I'm looking forward to it, but I have had many creative exchanges with Jeremy in his role as the organizer of the Gebser Society. When it was here 2 years ago, I interacted with him very, very enjoyable way. So anyway, that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Always your introductions take us to a different place than we expected to go to. I'm curious to hear what Ed's going to say about the interview. I guess you said a few things on the forum already, but which I didn't read all the way through. But I love listening to Jeremy talk about Gebser. He has a very nuanced understanding of things, and a very how can I say it? He's rich in classical references as well as other references, which I find very interesting in the way that he talks. That said, I haven't read all of the Ever-Present Origin, but I've read maybe 60–70% of it. So I do have a general understanding of maybe not everything about Gebser, but some of it. And I found the conversation with Jeremy kind of tangential. That is to say, he talks around Gebser, but he doesn't actually he doesn't address Gebser directly, I found. And so I sort of had to think carefully about what he was saying, because I think my reading of Gebser isn't as deep as his. Maybe that's part of what's going on. And so I felt slightly out of my depth listening to this presentation, because it seemed to go into areas of Gebser where my understanding is not that strong, or possibly I haven't read even the relevant passages. But so I wanted to take part in the conversation today because because I am interested in Gebser and the work around Gebser, and also I like, as I say, Jeremy's approach on things. But I'm slightly feel out of kilter a little bit with what he was talking about, and I'm not quite sure how to integrate what you were saying, Johnny. Although I do like your use of the term "new wine" as a question mark. So I always think, is it new wine that we're looking at, or is it new bottles that we're looking at? Because the body, the way we, if you think, if the wine, you know, I'm sort of pushing the analogy, but if the wine is the soul and the bottle is the body, I mean, you know, that's maybe too dualistic, but maybe the bottle isn't the same. You know, even if the wine is not the same, but maybe the bottle isn't the same either. And it's kind of, maybe I'm just being playful with it, but
I don't think there's anything wrong with being playful, Geoffrey. I think that's one of the ways that we work with things and try and get a better understanding of what they are. We actually do need to, like kids do, they pick things up and turn them around and take them apart or try to and pull them and stick them in their mouths and whatever it is that their parents tell them, don't do that, that's not what you, but that's all what you need to, we need to do all those things. And one of the, to go back to the interview just quickly, one of the things that I think your observation is pretty well on, that in a lot of instances he kind of talks about or at Gebser, but not necessarily from Gebser. But I don't think that's necessarily a detracting part of this. His book itself, John hasn't read it, I did, is in many ways almost a kind of an extension of what Gebser was talking about. Gebser, the last part, when you finally get in the back where he talks about integral consciousness and all the examples that he's been able to identify. Jeremy picks up at that point and tries to show what might be happening now that fits into that scheme of things. What is it that we're looking at today? Gebser was looking at things of his time, and Jeremy's looking at things of his time to see where do we find evidence of this diaphaneity or this transparency or this integrality that Gebser talks about. And one of the problems with dealing with Gebser, period, is he's as good as unknown. There's a small circle of people that engage with him. Most of them, we know, you were at the conference, you've met 90% of them. I'm exaggerating, okay? But, you know, John's met them as well. I haven't met all of them, but some of them I've been associated with for a long time. And it's a very small circle of people that actually seriously, for the most part, he's just ignored. And one of the reasons, I don't know what the reasons are. I have a few conjectures of what the reasons might be. So whenever you start to talk about Gebser, and this also, I noticed this in the interview, it was about an hour long, and the first 40 minutes was trying to set the stage so that one could even talk about Gebser, not even relating what Gebser is about, just so that people who are listening to this have some kind of an idea what's being talked about. This whole idea that we don't perceive or engage reality now in the same way that our forebears did is really difficult for a lot of people to grasp. It's one of those things that it can be pushed off into, I think this is what Wilbur suffered from. He got pushed off into the New Age corner. And so nobody took him as seriously as maybe they needed to. I think Wilbur has some very intelligent things to say. I kind of agree with John. In the end, he overcomplicates it, and I can't deal with all of the complexity of levels and colors and lines and whatever that is. That's too much for me. What I like about Gebser is there's a handful of structures, and I can deal with a handful. And for me, I use him more as a tool to help me develop a vocabulary to talk about how things are different now than we were before. One of the this comes up in the Axial Age discussion that we're having. One of the people who is referenced is Merlin Donald, because he also has this theory of consciousness evolution. And he says specifically it's about the evolution of consciousness. Gebser goes to great pains to avoid even, distancing himself from evolution in that sense. I always refer to what Gebser talks about as an unfoldment of consciousness, because the key to, I think, Gebser's understanding, or to understanding Gebser, is gaining an appreciation for the increasing intensification of consciousness. That's something that I wrestle with a great deal. I'm not exactly sure what that means, or how that manifests, or it's my, because a lot of times I find my consciousness, or what I think is my consciousness, exceedingly dull. So to think that I'm somewhere along an intense scale and it's that dull is a little disconcerting at times. But I believe Gebser is right in that however we relate to the world around us now, July 16th, 2019, is qualitatively different from how Akhenaten related to the world 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, whenever Akhenaten was running around, or how the alleged figure of Christ engaged the world, or the people in the Middle East at that time. I think that's changed, and I think what most people who deal with these kinds of subjects have a problem with is we haven't actually changed biologically. Our brains haven't actually changed in that time in any significant way, but we don't use our brains the same way that our forebears had. And trying to get a handle on that or understand that is an extremely challenging undertaking, I think. And it's one that it's hard to do at the level at which we are, because that's where we are. The thing that I want to tie this back to what John was saying at the beginning, because you're right, he always takes us to this other place. But the value in that is it kind of off-centers us. It allows us to take another look from another part. It's the Einsteinian thing. You can't solve a problem at the same level it was created. You kind of have to get out of it somehow and go at it from another way. And so whatever helps us do that, I think, is a very constructive thing to do, because that's exactly what we need at this time. And Gebser, directly or indirectly, allows us to do that. So when we start, we only have our consciousness to think about consciousness, and we kind of get wrapped up in this circle. We're kind of in a trap. But we all know somehow that however it is that we're engaging this, and however our consciousness is engaging what we consider to be reality, is not static. And it feels, at least to me, right at the moment, that it's changing significantly. But I don't know where or how, in what direction, or what that might let in the end be, or what it would look like, or how any of us will experience it. And that's part of the dilemma that I have with all of these discussions that we have, because we all talk a lot about things because we have trouble talking about the things themselves, in a way. And I notice as I'm trying to make this clear to you guys, it's becoming ever less clear to me. So I'm going to have to take a step back at the moment and try and regather my thoughts. But those were my initial impressions from the first couple of things that you guys said. So I hope I didn't muddy the water too much.
Well, it helped me out, and I feel it's giving a direction to the conversation. I guess taking it from where you said we get off-kiltered or off-centered by the presentation that reception of John's view, and many others do that. And I guess going back to the podcast episode, I don't know too much about the previous episodes. That seems to be a good projection, but just the term "a side view" reminds me of what we're doing here, or what we always do, or and what I forgot the name of the host, but he seems to be a very adept interviewer. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been, ever since the book came out that Jeremy wrote, I've been kind of loosely following along with some of the other interviews. And that, as any other presentation of a book will go, you're introducing the topic. The book as a whole is an introduction to Gebser, and that's a tall order. And Jeremy does a great job of, as we're all noting here, honing in on kind of the core value, giving a good biographical understanding and Gebser's place in time. While at the same time, he does tie in a lot of issues that are, or art, writing, and thought that's part of our current age. And so this side view, this alternate view, it reminds me of that elephant metaphor. You can only see the arm, or one of the legs, or the tail, or the tusk, whatever it might be. But in order to take a step back, you'll have to go really far back to get a whole view. And then by the time you come back to where the others are, you'll say, well, I saw everything, but now I can only see this one leg again, and I can only loosely describe it with what language we have. And I know towards the end of the conversation, what I liked was some of the questions that were asked, questions from I guess the Twitter feed. He received questions from others, which takes it into this social and communal aspect. It's not just a one-on-one reciting verbatim what some interviewer might ask. It was in the moment thinking that was done, and they reached, I believe, a different level. And I guess what I just glanced through the book, and some of the references, I can't pronounce it right, Floridium, but the references that Jeremy gives for the contemporary view, some science fiction references like Le Guin and Jeff Vandermeer is one that I just happened to pick up and I completely forgot. But that ties in with Timothy Morton's hyperobjects, but it's just too big to take in, this massive strangeness that we're in. But Jeff Vandermeer, I recommend it to Geoffrey at least, who likes science fiction. The book Born, which takes this strange bioengineered object that becomes kind of like a child for this individual, Rachel, who's in this story as kind of a post-apocalyptic story, and she takes this being that becomes something other, and the description of the otherness is kind of spot on where we are at this time. But I don't know where to go with this. I don't want to keep introducing my thoughts that are not tying in much, but yeah, Jeremy does a great job of piecing together what we know and what we don't know and where we're going.
He also mentioned Nora Bateson and somaticity. And many of us, Geoffrey and Doug and I, we worked on Bateson, Gregory and Nora's work. And so we're sort of familiar with that. I wouldn't want to try to redefine it, but I think she's looking at warm data rather than the algorithmic kind of collections that are shaping so many of our media, social media events. But warm data would be different from that kind of data. And I was also wanting to connect that. You mentioned I think you started to talk about the problem of other minds, Doug, about the other and what in the world is the other. I'm also wanting to quote from our colleague TJ. He asked in the thread, what kind of social media might truly wear the whole transparency and the time freedom in the 21st century? That's a very big question. So I really appreciate everything that's been communicated thus far, and how we're going to give a size and a shape to all of these communications and what we could be moving towards. I remember in the Gebser Society event that happened in New York about 2 years ago, our friend Lisa Morawski was there, and she gave a talk on, I think it was some Nag Hammadi literature and the Gnostics, and we recited together, sort of like a Lectio Divina, some of these Gnostic poems, which were really designed to create a field effect that was shared. And she later talked about the difference of integral, are we talking about integral, or are we talking from integral? And how would we know the difference? I thought that was very interesting because I just sort of blurted it out. I said, it's like the twist in the Mobius strip. It's like a Klein bottle, because it's ambiguous about what's inside and what's outside when you observe a Klein bottle. And it's like that. So I went immediately to a metaphor. And it was really funny because a light went off in Lisa, because she has been, she's a Klein bottle freak. I think she collects Klein bottles as a hobby. And she's also we also started to discuss paraconsistent logic, which she knows a whole lot more about than I do. And Graham, I can't remember his name. He's a logician who's working with paraconsistent logic. And we were both, and she was meeting that person for dinner that evening. So she was really delighted by the fact that we seem to be drawing upon very similar kind of references. And I think that's of great interest to me, that the Mobius and the twist on the Mobius strip and the Klein bottle, and what I think Ed was talking about, that dilemma that we all find ourselves in as we, rather than just talking about the integral in a meta capacity, what happens when we start communicating from the integral? I think that will be I think we already are, perhaps. We're just not paying attention well enough to that when it happens. So I believe the higher octave, as an integral has been articulated by Gebser, is a higher octave of the archaic, the magical, the mythical, and the mental. When all of those previous structures are in alignment, we can then draw upon all of those different intelligences of those previous structures in the now, right now. And I believe we're all probably doing this, but once again, we may not be sponsoring. You may not be sponsored particularly well. As you said, seems to be a small group of humanity that seems to be absorbed in these Gebser studies and in the various kinds of integralisms that are floating around. But those who are absorbed or are interested in it are very interested in it. So I think we need to really start really paying more attention to this when we're speaking from integral, rather than talking about it in a meta kind of fashion. And I think we're in that tension. We've talked a lot about the postmodern, between the deficient rational and this integral hypothetical integral higher octave that Gebser was claiming we're moving towards. I believe we should expect these oscillations between these different structures in their deficient forms and in their efficient forms. And if we can start to spot them better, this is efficient and this is a deficient form, I believe we could be moving more and more towards that higher octave. And I love the higher octave because it's so musical, because that makes total sense. That it's much more like a vibration or something that we resonate with, rather than another concept. I think our concepts are getting pretty thin. And I think it's Adam Roberts, who's the interviewer here. I think I've heard him say that, you know, concepts are just feelings that we've sort of dressed up in a certain way. But I think we're all sort of having to tune in to the somatic intelligence, the cognitive intelligence, the interplay between, and the voice. And how do we use the voice to register these very fluid affective zones and different forms of time? I think this is something that was spoken of very elegantly in the interview. So I haven't answered TJ's question here about what kind of social media might truly wear the whole transparency and the time freedom in the 21st century. But I think we're in this experiment. We're using social media in a different way, I think, than it has been used to sell products or to put forward some sort of political agenda. And we're in the middle of this experiment, and I hope it's a safe to fail experiment, but we never know, do we? So thanks.
So we're in the zone, the stalker zone, right? I wonder if Lisa keeps her Klein bottles in her fifth dimensional closet that she's got tucked away somewhere.
She has them all over the place.
I would come back to, there's a lot in Johnny, what Johnny said that I'd come back to, but Ed, you mentioned this idea that people have trouble getting around their heads that our experience of the world is different now than it was. I kind of feel that, I mean, I can understand that people find that difficult, but I kind of find that it's obvious. But it may be because I read a book way back in the 80s called The Reenchantment of the World by Morris Berman, which if I think I had read Gebser, then I would have seen the link between that work and Gebser's work. But it's it's not as deep as Gebser's book, but it is a rethinking of modern science in terms of this. It's a kind of a study of medieval civilization and how, and he picks apart many of the perceptions that show up in paintings and literature and so forth that are clearly different from what we have today, and so argues essentially that I mean, part of his argument is that our perception of the world has changed, and the other part of his argument is science has denatured to some extent our understanding of the world, and so this is why it's called the reenchantment of the world. It's this effort to re-give back some of the richness to our perceptual understanding of the world. But it's close to Gebser. I think Gebser is deeper because he goes to a broader picture. It's not a science-based approach, even though he does reference a lot of science. But it's more a kind of I guess it's a consciousness-based approach, Gebser, fundamentally. Right from the get-go, it's kind of interested in consciousness. So it's a different kind of focus. What was I? Maybe I don't have to remember everything that Johnny said. It'll come back. I did want to mention, because this, so Johnny, I think what you said, I feel is key, is this idea that speaking with the integral rather than, or from the integral rather than about the integral. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned, you know, Ed, you mentioned the Gebser scholars. I met them at last year's Gebser meeting in Boulder. Maybe not all of them, and maybe not the same ones that Johnny met, but a certain subset of them. They're not all thinking with Gebser. Some of them are thinking about Gebser. There's some very scholarly types in that mix who have, I think they understand the issue, but they aren't themselves able to get around that kind of way of thinking about things, despite the best intentions, if you like. And it's not an easy thing to do. I think when we first put up the stuff about quantum poetry, Johnny, I think one of your first comments was, is this about quantum poetry, or is this from quantum poetry? This kind of question that you asked. And it's what drove me to write the poem that I wrote with quantum. That's to say, the poem addresses the issue of quantum, but attempts to do so from within a poetic framework, as opposed to from an intellectual framework. Looking back on quantum. So I did, you know, I did have a kind of response, and it's not easy to do this kind of thing. It requires, to some extent, disentangling one's own habits and reconstructing them in a different way. And I think that's part of what this whole process that you're all talking about of trying to, I don't like to use the term re-engineer because it's not quite that, but rethink ourselves into a place that's different from the place that we've always inhabited. So it's kind of why I like this idea of the bottle rather than the wine. You know, I don't know about the wine. I don't know that I'm very good vignier, you know, but I understand the bottle, or I think I do. And I think I can work at reorganizing bottles. In a way, that's what the garments are about. They're bottles in a way. So I don't know much about identity, but I can rework the garments, and then the identity will kind of follow from the garments, which is a kind of bottle approach. So I have to say, as a boy, my brother, I grew up in rural British Columbia, outside of the city of Victoria, in the countryside. And my brother and we used to hike up into the back hills in the area where we grew up, which was a very wild countryside, if you like, in the sort of British Columbia way, along the coast, and rocky outcroppings and interesting vegetation for the region and so forth. And we used to have these big discussions as we were walking and hiking, where we talked about this idea of it's kind of the discussion that we're having here about how could you think yourself into a new place, and is that even possible? And we have these, so in a way I find a kind of an echo between what we do here and those discussions I had as a teenager, where we used to say this is kind of completely wacko what we're talking about. This is, you know, you're not going to convince other people to do this. And yet here you guys are already convinced. So
give us you're tired, you're poor, and you're wacko. Wackos are allowed.
That's why I like Doug's poem so much, because again, your poetic response is a response from rather than about, right? So even though it might have elements of about, it's a practice that comes from rather than a practice that comes about.
I liked your references to Morris Bergman, is that his name? Who wrote The Reenchantment?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of William Irwin Thompson, who started Lindisfarne. I think Jeremy has referenced Thompson quite a bit. And we've all studied Aurobindo, and we've looked at Kripal. We've looked at weird studies. I think Michael Garfield, we know through Carrie Welch, the interview that he did with her. So, and the Gebser Society. And of course, Ken Wilber, his work. So I think this is all a lot, like a really big Venn diagram with lots of overlaps and lots of different kinds of emphasis. And there are some departures quite a bit. And there's the scholarly types, and then there are the scholarly practitioners and the scholar activists. And I think there's something for everybody in all of this. But I wanted to create, moving from a polyphasic to a monophasic. We live in a monophasic culture where the real is established by one narrow bandwidth, and our polyphasic natures is shelved or put aside, or it can come on special occasions, like in fiction or in movies or poetry. But I think this is, I think appreciating that twist in the Mobius strip and the ambiguity of the Klein bottle, the strangeness and the weirdness of the inside and the outside in certain kinds of non-conventional experiences. I think this is, these would be signs to me that we're wacko enough, but we're not too wacko, okay? Because I do think you need to be grounded in kind of social reality so that you can then imagine in ways that are safe to fail, alternatives. And I think this has been where, you know, good scholarship is to be drawn. You know, it's great when someone has done this research and can share it and articulate and communicate it effectively. And if we can find those researchers and look at their papers or their performances on YouTube, and we can circulate that among ourselves, I think it's great. As long as we don't become another information dump. I think this is a real problem when we just are, in our enthusiasm over somebody, we just sort of, we just turn this into a kind of a virile kind of, let's make it go viral. And I think what's going viral, as Adam Roberts said in that interview, I think with Jeremy, is a very superficial kind of thinking. So I think we can do something different, and we have been doing something different by paying a collective attention to a text or a video or our own communications in these forums or our own writing. And going back and forth in the in-between between our expressions with our face and our voice, trying to communicate a confusing idea or something that we might be actually clear about, or something in between, and what we write and how we can compose and structure writing sentences, which is a very different kind of exercise than speaking, which is much more like playing soccer than it is like composing structured sentences. And so I think this is what we're doing that I think is really useful, is we're paying attention to these kind of interplays between speech, the performance like we're doing here, and writing, and actually going to another level with writing. Like it could be an essay or a poem or a bit of fiction, which is what I like to dabble in. So anyway, I think we're doing a pretty good job when we're at our best. And I love the idea that, you know, we're using metaphors in conscious ways. And I think we started this in the Axial Age by asking for directly for the seminar to be useful. It will be like what? And we all had different metaphors. And I think Geoffrey offered the garment. I think for me, it was a prayer. I think for TJ, it was a path that was lit. And Doug, I think you had, could you remind me what your metaphor was? Oh, you weren't even on that call. It was Michael. Michael had the metaphor of a storyteller around a fire, of going on a pilgrimage, like in Chaucer's Tales. So I think these metaphors can be unique, but we can all share them with one another, and we can realize they're not off the wall. They're not wacko, because we can share them, and we can create a shared reality together when we go into these very difficult texts like the Axial Age and its consequences. So I think that's a very good sign that I believe we have that capacity, that latent capacity, but maybe if we can make that a front and center in our attention, this capacity for metaphor, what could happen next? So that's my big research question. And I have loved the fact that this community has been so tolerant of my, these clean language sort of investigations, because really what I'm interested in is metaphor and how we can use metaphor rather than be abused by metaphors that have, I think, run out of gas, literally. And one of the metaphors that I think recently has become, I'm very sensitive, allergic to, is God the Father. God the Father doesn't work for me. Nor the Son and the Holy Ghost. None of that works for me. But I am very drawn to God as stranger, God as orphan and widow, God as the wounded soldier. And it was I think it's unusual in a way that the figure that came to me in that polyphasic zone, that hybrid zone, was a very masculine man with scars on his body. So I'm sort of understanding that God could be a stranger and God could be one of the wounded. And that resonates with me. So, and God is at risk. And I think these are the kind of tensions and stresses that we've been exploring here, and I believe Gebser was as well in the turbulent times which he lived through. So I'm just putting that out there, and because I think that to dwell in that house forever, that house that we can dwell in forever with the Lord, which I think was a stranger to the Old Testament prophets. We're going to have to create that, and through our imaginations. And I find it very odd that this stranger, who looked like a wounded person, offered me a basket full of cupcakes with bits of chocolate, and how my mouth started to water.
It still is, eh, John? Two things. First, to Geoffrey and the quantum poetics and Doug's poem, and writing from, and you're listening, how do we know when we're speaking about the integral or from the integral, or whatever that might be? It's a nice way to try to get a handle on that. One of the things about Gebser's work that I think makes it so difficult, we've had this discussion, Katina was in on this, we had this little runaround about, are we in the integral and whatnot, and I was being curmudgeon-y as usual and whatnot, but it was heading in the right direction. It didn't get too far, but there's always fits and starts, and we do something and then pick up later and whatnot. But how would we know? How would we recognize? You know, this is also the the conundrum that the Tenon presented us with his Meru stuff. If you are, in fact, the creator of the universe or a higher order being, go back to Flatland. You are a three-dimensional creature. How do you make yourself known to two-dimensional beings? What do you have to, what has to happen for that to happen? So if we start extrapolating from that, if God is a 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, 32-dimensional, whatever it is, it doesn't matter right now. How do they make that aware? How would we recognize it? How would we know? And one of the things that Gebser tried to do, and he's stated this in things that he's written, was to show how it works. He was trying to make an example that one could follow. And that's why it is so difficult to follow for some people, because if you do go at this purely conceptually, if you went at it from a very rational mindset, post-enlightenment, whatever, then you're looking at, when he says something like intensification, you're looking at it as a concept. And I don't think it's a concept at all. That's why I wanted, and that's the other thing I want to say. That's why I want to come back to you, John. You know, I resonate with music metaphors. And you go, oh, it's a higher octave. Well, okay, the note's the note. It's regardless of where it is. But how do I express that in as intensification of something? How do I, you know, I go, it's a higher octave, okay, and that kind of distracts me. I'm not saying it's a bad choice of word. That's the way we say it. That's how. And now I know what you're talking about. I'm looking for ways to, what would we say? How do we identify the two notes that, if we're speaking about two notes in music, that one is more intense than the other? I don't know. See, this is what I'm kind of grappling with, because if it's an intensification, well, how? It must feel some way. There's got to be some feeling that's involved in that. For my thinking right now, I could be way off base. So we're looking for that metaphor that would be of that integrality. You know, and so I agree, and I you know, because you've hinted at it and stated it as well. We're going to try a whole lot of them out before we find it's the ones that work. And we don't know who they're going to work with, and they're going to work with some people better with others. And we do have one advantage, that we kind of know each other here. You know, Geoffrey's up in the woods with his brother talking about weird shit, and realizes, well, there's other weirdos out there. But for me, the thing is, I don't think this is weird at all. And I don't think I think what's wacko is that you insist that it couldn't be this way. That this isn't even possible to be this way, because we're evidence that it can be this way. That's what we do. And we talk about it in these ways, and we're not the only ones that do it. I, like you, I'm not into virality, but it would be nice to know where and how one can touch in and tap into those others as well. I think like the Weird Studies podcast. So, well, we know there's a couple of others over there, and they're talking to people, and they're putting it there where we can encounter it and we can engage it, and we know them insofar as, you know, we can exchange things on the forum, you know, which is a huge step forward, which I don't think has anything to do with social media, as social media is currently conceived at all. I think social media is a concept, and we're not the concept. We're not the concept. Well, that's not the thing. We are social, and we happen to use media to be that way, but we're not social media. You know what I mean? This is where you keep kind of tripping over the words that you have to use, because I don't think we can just sit here and make up words and then everybody will know what we're talking about. You kind of have to use the ones that everybody else uses, or otherwise you're going to lose them too quickly. I mean, we lose them fast enough as it is. You know, I love TJ's example where his friend said he saw the word spiritual and boom, beat feet. You know, I'm out of here. I'm not even going to think about considering this. Why? Is it, is it the devil or what? Is it, you're going to you're going to burn in hell if you look at that. What is that? You know, why is that word so fear inspiring to some people? I don't get it myself. It really takes a lot to frighten me in that sense. It's like, okay, well, you said it. I may not know, I may not understand what you said. And if things are unclear, I always have the opportunity to ask, you know, could you like clarify what you mean by, you know, and is that, how did you come up, or whatever it is, and then, you know, we can do this. But just categorically going, okay, I'm sorry, I'm out of here, I can't do this, I find that a little short-sighted and certainly not helpful for anything that we need to be doing. Because if anybody needs to be engaging these kinds of things, it's the people that are running away from it. But they don't even know why they're running, for the most part, you know, which I find terribly sad. You know, because when I'm running, I usually know why. If I'm going to exert that much effort, I can tell you why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I need reasons for those kinds of things. So anyhow, I'm getting off subject.
I liked what you said about the two notes and which note is more intense than the other. And I was wondering about the stressed and unstressed syllable in iambic pentameter, which is, you know, the metered speech that Shakespeare used, and that English is iambic. So there's this, you know, that stress and unstressed dynamic creates rhythm and pattern and expectation and anticipation. And I can follow you and you can follow me because of this. So I think that's that's interesting. And we've talked a lot about poetics and the ethical and the aesthetic and where we draw the line, where do we make the cut? And I think it's inevitably fuzzy. And I think it's the comfort I'm quoting Nora Bateson here, if we're clear, we've probably asked the wrong question. So there is an element of, certainly there is clarity, a value that I think we all share as humans. We like things to be clear, but also appreciation for ambiguity. And we probably aren't going to start with clarity. Clarity may emerge through this appreciation of the ambiguity and the paradox and the dilemma and the conflict, which is beautiful on some level, horrific maybe on other levels. And I think this is the challenge, because I feel the interplay between the subtle, the very subtle, and the physical, how in these imaginal zones, it's not just arbitrary or relative, that there's something objective about these imaginal zones. I think there's been a lot of thinking about this. But there's the physical five senses we're all familiar with, and then there's the transphysical senses. And I'm using the word transcendent in a sort of aware of what a sticky word that is. But I think we're going to have to figure out how to tolerate the transcendent, because these experiences are intense. And also, we got to chop wood and carry water, and, you know, change the baby's diaper and get the bills paid. So I think it's the interplay of the very ordinary and the extraordinary that I believe the integral will be coming from that appreciation, rather than making a cut in a way that is, I believe, very arbitrary, or that just recapitulates the basic classical mind-body problems we've all inherited in the modern age. And how we can, I think, go back and read the Bible and reread Shakespeare or Chaucer or whoever, you know, you resonate with, and it can become alive again through but we don't have to go back into that previous time and cut ourselves off from all the learnings that have have occurred to humanity. But I'm going to test everyone's patience because I want to quote something from the Bible again. This resonated with me when I was about 12 years old. Maybe I was younger than that. Oh, I'm reading from, this is the Bible I got when I was 10 years old. I still have it. It's pretty battered, I have to tell you. But I remember, so this is the same Bible I was reading, the same physical Bible that I was reading when I was 10 years old when I got this. And I was very drawn to this great conflict between the king, who was Saul, king of the Israelites, and David, who killed the Goliath, became a national hero. But David was also a shepherd, and he was a poet. And he would play music to Saul, who was often very troubled. Seems like he was quite an insomniac. And then there was Saul's son, Jonathan. And Jonathan was, of course, going to be the prince who's going to carry on the line. And there was this tension between Saul and Jonathan and David. And Saul saw that Jonathan loved David. And this caused a lot of resistance in Saul. And David was paranoid because Saul had taken a javelin, threw it at him while he was singing on his harp. And he ran out of the tent, and he was very frightened, and he told Jonathan that he was frightened of Saul because he says, "I have found grace in your eyes." And so Jonathan and David conspire with one another. How do they avoid this angry patriarch, his wrath? And he's also king. He can cut off heads if he wants to. And so they arrange a signaling system. So Jonathan is going to work for David to put him in a safe space so that he can modify Saul's paranoid plans. But I find this very beautiful. When Jonathan approaches Saul and why he's so wrathful towards his friend David, Saul gets angered again. He says, "Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die." So Jonathan finds David, and they weep together. David arose out of a place toward the south and fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another until David exceeded. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, The Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So I think I really resonate with this as a gay man. I think this is a love affair, and it's a very strange one because it's a triangle between Saul and Jonathan, his son, and David. And I believe Saul is in love with David as much as Jonathan is, because you don't get this mad at somebody unless something of the shadow, of the erotic shadow, has been activated. And just one more final quote, and then I'll shut up because I've probably gone on too long about this. When they both die, Jonathan and Saul are killed in battle. There's this beautiful lament that Jonathan has, where he grieves for both Saul and Jonathan. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places, and I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So I just hope that I'm making a little bit something, making more explicit something that was definitely, when I was in my youth, unexpressed. And I believe that there is an undercurrent of this in our sacred literature, of the unexpressed and unsaid, unarticulated, but it still is there for those who have ears to hear. And this is what I hope is the integral age, if there is such a thing, or that higher octave. We would be doing this. We would be scanning the literature of the past, and we would be allowing for these alternate ways of knowing and these alternate readings and expressions to come forward in our public discourse. Because I believe that we are in very big danger during the postmodern times, when we were deconstructing everything without reconstructing anything at all, of giving away to the rabid fundamentalists the Bible. And I would get angry. I said, why are we letting them have the Bible? This doesn't belong to them. It belongs to all of us, and it's the foundational literature of Western civilization. This was 30 years ago when I was ranting about this, but I think that we need to be very vigilant and do it better than we've ever had to do before, and do it on purpose, creating these forums where these alternate ways of knowing can be brought forward into our public discourse events, and maintaining a high quality of the critical and the skeptical, so that we don't slide into the pit of the new age, which I think is got some things right and got some things really wrong. So I'm just sharing that. And thank you for this opportunity to perform in public this literature, which I so dearly love, and which I believe is in my, it's the queer astral that I'm interested in, the Akashic records. I think there's a space that's very queer, and that's been under-articulated, under-represented. And that's where I go, in these hybrid spaces, in the in-between, these liminal zones. And hopefully I can bring them back in a way that, so that I'm still physically intact, can use my voice in a way that can resonate and maybe harmonize with the alternate ways of knowing of this group and other groups that are working in this way as well. So thank you for this opportunity.
Did you say something, Geoffrey? Or wish to say something?
You first.
So I like that you have a document that you, more than a document, but the Bible from when you were 10 years old. And looks like the cover's still intact. I imagine that you flipped through it more than 1 or 2 times, and there's probably notes that fill, mostly intact there. You haven't had to tape and retape it, or there's no duct tape there. But I think that goes along with this old wine and new skin somehow. But that's the contents, the inside of your Bible still have the old skin there, but each reading, it's been through a few 10-year cycles, perhaps 5 at this point, if you were 10 at the time when you received it. It was probably there when you experienced that traumatic event of loss of your functioning laying. It sounds like when you were in the midst of reading deeply, I'm sure that was one of the books that you also examined. And now you're opening it again 50 something years later. And it redefines your interpretation is reinterpreted each time you open it. And your presentation of that story, maybe you read that when you were 10, and now what meaning does it have for you? And you placed it onto us with your reading here, and I've not heard the story directly from the Bible. I've heard it before from others about, I don't know, maybe one of my pastors in the past read it to me or provided a sermon for it, but I'm going to quote from Sloterdijk, and it was when he was mentioning the uncontainable within or without the container, without the actual container. So he's saying that the vascular reversal, it is not the wall of the jug that makes it possible to pour in the liquid. Rather, because the contents contain themselves, the vessel appears together with and around them. Cosmography and uterography can converge. I don't fully remember what appealed to me at that time, or what he is directly talking about, but it made complete sense at the time. I think he's talking about Achilles' shield, and the border around it is the river or a watery surface, and so it's not an actual container, though it is within a shield that's some sort of container. But we're often using a container to contain the uncontainable, and I don't know what that means for this right now. I wanted to go somewhere with that, and I think we'll go with you, Geoffrey.
I'm happy to riff off
Yeah,
that,
please.
Doug, and you can come back to it in a moment, because I think I love your reading of the Bible and the stories, which I imagine are Old Testament stories. And it's funny because, so I think I explained before that I become involved in one of the local synagogues and what they've done is they've set up a series of it's like a discussion group, but it's both to talk about Judaic traditions, but also anything else that might be relevant, according to the person who's giving the talk. So we've had a talk on early Jewish, one of the early battles in relation to a kind of a revolution in the time of just before, in the same period of time as Jesus Christ, which was kind of looking at messianic issues around that time, among several individuals. We had one talk recently about, it was a talk about the notion of compassion as it finds a root in the Old Testament, even though the Old Testament is often thought of being rather less compassionate. But, you know, in this sort of reading suggests that, in fact, there are very strong elements of compassion even in the Old Testament. And for instance, so one of the quotations that this person who's a collaborator actually at the university as well used is from this person called Hillel, who predeceded Jesus, or was around the same time, but maybe a little bit before, who said, if I am not for myself, who will be? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And the discussion was about, it doesn't say, who am I? It says, what am I? Which is a very different question and it takes you for a very different place. It takes you into a nature, into what is it to be human, whereas who am I comes to, you know, sort of more superficial issues. But what am I takes you to the very bottom of what it is to be human. And so anyway, it was an interesting discussion about these things. One of the things I really like about these discussions that I have with these folk is because in a way, I mean, I've read the Old Testament, I've read the New Testament. I have to say, really, the stories in the Old Testament, I found they were the ones who stayed with me. Not because I read them first, although that may have been true, but because in some ways they're more, I don't know what they're more, the French comes, croustillant, they're crustier. they have more of the good and the bad all rolled into one in a way that the New Testament doesn't. And those in a way, so it's the stories of Moses and the stories of Job, and all of these stories are the ones that speak to me more than the New Testament stories, really. So I'm sort of rediscovering some of this, these associations and this sort of reflection about the stories that are present in the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament. You know, I live in Quebec City. Quebec City is still very Catholic. There are about maybe 20 churches in a relatively small city. Most of them are Catholic. I think there's 2 Anglican churches and maybe 1 other Protestant church, or a couple, but that's it. Everything else is Catholic. And of course, the Catholic traditions are readings from both the New Testament and the Old Testament. So you get a bit of both, but they're always heavily flavored by the New Testament, if you like. So anyway, I think it's this. So I have my own project for working with this. It's this. So this novel that I wrote called Third Testament, which is not actually the story. It's not the book of the Third Testament. It's a novel about how the document that I call the Third Testament came about to be written. But of course, there are sort of excerpts from the Third Testament inside this book about how it came to be written. And they're kind of suggestive, right? And what is the Third Testament? It's an attempt to make the different religions speak together. It's not necessary to integrate them in a single perspective, but it's to give them a common voice in a way that they can relate to each other. And it also is built around this idea, that which is to some extent maybe my own struggles to understand religion and spirituality and so forth, of the idea of an emergent God. So a God that is not predefined and pre-existing and omniscient and omnipresent, but a God that is in the process of emerging, and humanity's process is part of this process of emerging, right? So, and the idea is that this the idea of an emerging God is a better reflection of current science, a scientific understanding of the world, than is the old kind of in a way, the God the Father kind of thing. In fact, the God the Stranger, I think, is, I mean, I love that, God the Stranger, as opposed to God the Father. So an emergent God is more a God the Stranger than a God the Father. And so I'm going to be giving one of these talks to the synagogue in October about the Third Testament. So I've got a lot of work between now and then to try and pull my ideas together about that. But I do think that this effort to make the religions speak to each other is part of what we're doing with what we're interested in for Integral. It's not just a a new way of looking at the world or a new way of acting in the world, because I think it's more than a new way of looking at the world. I think it's a new way of acting in the world, right? That we're talking about when we're talking about integral. But it's also a way of acting in the world that resonates or stays open to the different religion and spiritual, maybe both, currents as they move through that. And so I think this sort of reading and rereading of the old texts. I mean, we've done it with the Bhagavad Gita and the sort of the Vedas. We've done a little bit of that via Aurobindo and that kind of reading, less the Buddha, but I guess Gebser brings in some of that to some extent as well. And but it's interesting to go back to the Old Testament, the Torah, in a sense, and the Judaic traditions as well as the Christian religion traditions, and of course the Quran as well. So it's the speaking together of these different things, and that is part of what interests me. And I have my own process for it. I also wanted to mention really quickly that I've been reading Went. So this was another book that Johnny threw at me. Quantum Mind and Social Science, Unifying Physical and Social Ontology. Doug actually talks about it in his poem. He talks about quantum social something or other, which I don't know if is a direct reference to this book or whether it's a reference to the broader discussion about these issues. I'm about 30% into the book. It's a tough book. I don't know how if you've read it all, Johnny, but it's not an easy read.
No, it's not. I need all the help I can get.
Even for somebody who has a fairly solid understanding of quantum physics, it's kind of I'm sure Lisa is probably at home with this, because it's kind of a logical argument more than it is a physical argument. It's kind of untangling all the different trains of thought that go into current understanding of quantum physics in different ways, and then trying to tease out of them something that can be useful in the context of social science. And I kind of would like to. So I also had, because you raised the issue of quantum entanglement at some point, Johnny, and I thought, maybe we could do a cafe on quantum entanglement. So I contacted Marco Massi, because his background is in physics too, to ask him whether he would collaborate on me on doing a cafe on quantum entanglement. And he's agreed to do that. So maybe not next week. I think it'll take a few weeks for us to get ready for it, but maybe beginning of August, sometime in there, we could plan for a cafe on quantum entanglement and check the dates with Marco, so that I was kind of hoping to read a bit more of Went before I got to there, but maybe it's not necessary that I read the whole book before we get there.
I would be curious about his chapters on language, which I think is towards the end of the book, or the middle of the book. I think is fascinating me. And I'm glad that you and Marco, if you could collaborate on this, I'm looking forward to that. Because also Marco has a background with Aurobindo.
Yes, exactly.
I think there's some interesting overlaps that could happen maybe between Savitri.
And of course, it's related to Gebser, because Gebser, of course, makes the link to quantum physics directly in his book, right? And so that's why I sort of, and this book is very interesting because it kind of proposes a kind of not a theory, but a theoretical framework for understanding quantum physics as a kind of explanation of consciousness, which is very strong as an argument. It's very controversial, but it's also very strong, and definitely worth looking at in a kind of Gebserian framework as well. So I'll stop there because I could go on, but
I would love to develop that further, but Ed, did you want to say something, or Doug? Did you want to chime in? Please do.
I just have a brief comment based on what Geoffrey said, and then I'll shut up. I said I was going to be quiet. But no, I guess in regards to the Went reference, I mentioned astral projection and that idea, but I've been reading Stuart Kaufman and John. Everybody's been mentioning Kripal and the sacred. We brought up kind of the inherited cultural stories, and I'm wondering. I don't know much about Sheldrake and morphic resonances, but I'm wondering the connection, which I want to explore, between Sheldrake and Went, between this morphic field or morphic resonance idea and the quantum social. There seems to be a connection to me. If not, they're saying the exact same thing with different words. I don't know, but so that's that. And then I just wanted to, what Ed said earlier about what we talk about here and how it's so easy. And at times I'm concerned that it's so easy, and bringing that out into the world. I just wanted to mention, because Geoffrey was talking about other groups, and the only other group I can talk with is the Quaker group. And I do lead the first hours occasionally, or I'm in charge, similar to how the cafe is run. I'm kind of in charge of managing it, and I introduced the Anatheism by Richard Kearney, and we had a great discussion. That it was neat to have our discussion and in relation to that discussion, which was more along the lines of the religious discussion and people's direct experience with Christianity and Judaism and whatnot. But there are, like we were saying, there's other pockets of these formations, and I'm wondering how all these various groupings can be pieced together. But yeah, thank you, Ed, for allowing me to speak. That's all I have to say.
You're allowed to speak as long as you want. I don't see anybody turning over egg timers here to tell you, okay, you had your time, now you're done. Just a couple of small things. One, John, if you would put the references to, I'm guessing that's from Samuel, 1 Samuel, on the forum, so I'd like to read them in the original if I can, all right? Because it's one thing to read things in translation, and it's another to read them in the original. And I think we need to interpret the text that we engage, that we encounter. I wanted to ask you which translation your Bible was, and then you started reading, and it's obvious.
I think it's the King James. Yeah.
Oh, it is. Oh, yeah.
It's pretty unmistakable. Yeah.
You get about 3 words into it, and you know exactly which one it is. Okay. Yeah. Which is the one that most of us, I grew up on that as well. Although, interestingly enough, when I was given a Bible, when I was 10 years old, it was the Revised Standard Version. So it wasn't the King James. They were trying to make it more accessible to us youth or whatever it was. And the thing is, and I do have to say this, it's a different book. I too am a big fan of the 23rd Psalm, and it's one everybody knows and everybody can quote and whatnot. And that very first verse, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, is 3 words in Hebrew. That's it. It's 11 letters, no more. It's very compact. It's very direct. It's also very, very rhythmic. It's Adonai, Roi, Echsa. And that's it. Okay? And there you kind of know. And that first word where I say Adonai is actually the 4-letter name of God, the Tetragrammaton, and that's not spoken. So either in modern days, people will say Hashem, the name, or Adonai is generally how the Jewish community would read that, which just is kind of like Lord, small l, kind of thing, just to get the equation. That the religions needs to talk to each other. This is what Geoffrey had mentioned. The Abrahamic religions are the way of thinking, the big problem in the world, because that's where we get most fundamentalists the quickest. The others have them as well, but okay, he's got a, but there's this idea of exclusivity that kind of flows into all of them that's very problematic. That's and it has a lot to do with cultural wars in the broader sense today. But the whole idea of the mirror work, which I'm sure Geoffrey hasn't taken a look at yet, goes about showing just how closely they are related, and that they all are using the same metaphors. And these metaphors were generated out of the text of the Bible and whatnot, because you can look at that in a whole different way. I know we all read the Bible, and I know we have this translation that, if I go back to that one session that we did do on Meru and the creation story, the first 28 letters of the book of Genesis can be read 900 different ways. And within the Jewish community, eventually all of those readings must be reconciled with one another. It takes you a long time to get them all so that you have some idea of how that all really, and then I think you get, well, what is resonating out of this? There's something beyond what it is that we're doing word-wise. I don't know how exactly to do that, but that's one of the reasons I play around with these things. That's kind of like my little hobby horse that I ride around on from time to time. That's why I'd like to know what the textual references are, to take a look at that from another point of view. But I think I think your point is well taken, regardless of whether we're reading it in translation or not. If you don't have a firm understanding of what's in the Bible, you have a hell of a time understanding almost anything that was written in Western literature in any language, and it's totally ignored. We're looking at texts, we're analyzing, we're making expertises on the structural integrity of a house, so to speak, without never looking at the foundation and wondering why it's probably going to collapse. And I think that's probably a dangerous thing to be doing. So if we can get people to do that, it's all much better. And as Geoffrey pointed out, they're the much more interesting stories. They're really, they're all rooted in life, deeply rooted in life. And because the society out of which they came was deeply rooted in the terrain in which it found itself, in its environment. It was, Nora Bates would love this, because it is a complete ecology that goes from the earth all the way up into heaven. And that's why this whole idea I find so interesting what we're doing in the Axial Age about this transcendence or not. It's a real sticky word, and is there and isn't there? And you look at this and you're going, I don't know if they're making a big difference, like you're saying they are. But we'll get to those discussions a little later, because it is fascinating to see how it can be looked at. Not just, okay, Bella sees it one way and Jonas sees it, and Casanova has an interesting piece in there about how, and you can see, you can look at this at different ways, but you can also see what all we're bringing to that party when looking at it. And we're not always making clear what that is. And once we start untangling some of that, some go away, and then other issues will arise at the same time. So it's this, we have to keep revisiting it. We have to keep going back at it. We have to take another look at it. And you'll read this story as a love story. I'll read this story as another, and it can never be, well, who's got the right interpretation? Because it's like the 900 verses. Well, they're all right in a sense, as when they're true to the text. But what is it that was? What's the deeper meaning of what we're all pointing at? This is kind of like Doug's elephant that you talked about at the beginning. You're looking at the leg, and I'm looking at the trunk, but there's something beyond that, and we can only do that when we actually compare it. I'm reading a book right now. I don't even know how I came across it and who recommended it. It's called Zen and the Unspeakable God. And it's about a guy who says, well, when we read mystical literature, it could have been a Kripal thing, now that I think about it, because he's a lot into gnosis and other ways, and mystical experience, and is that knowledge, and what does that mean, and how does that come about? And we look at these mystics who are like trying to communicate the ineffable, but as he points out, we actually are reading a lot more into that than may be there. So he tries to develop a hermeneutic in order to do that, and then lets the mystic speak for himself. And he compares three examples. One is Ibn Arabi, who was a Muslim, Meister Eckhart, a Christian, and I'd have to look in the book, a Zen scholar. So he's looking at this three so you can get a better understanding of how do we understand that at all. It's a short book, but absolutely, I think, brilliant as far as what is actually entailed in trying to understand what somebody's telling you. Just taking from that perspective, especially when we're talking about things that are extremely hard. This is why I think of you when I'm reading it a lot. Things that are extremely hard to put into words.
That's right.
Yeah, and these guys are going, I'm using these, kind of figure it out, but they're giving you all the clues that you need to figure it out as well. That's the kind of the beauty of what I see going on in there. So there's a couple of things.
I have a request for you, Ed. Could you, would you be so kind as to like recite, not now perhaps, but if you could just post a reciting it in Hebrew, the 23rd Psalm?
The whole thing?
If you can, because I would love to hear the way
I'll have to practice on it because it will sound like some quirky American reading Hebrew.
That's okay. I would just love to hear it.
You hear it?
Yeah, because to contrast and compare it with the King James Version, which I've been brought up with.
I can actually put up a link where you can find, there's a site and you can read the Hebrew text gets read by an actual Hebrew speaker.
Okay.
He's got kind of this James Earl Jones voice, this deep Darth Vader voice when he reads it. That would probably be better than if I did it. But I think I can find something that'll suit your purposes there.
Whatever, because I think that's very interesting to hear in translation and to hear the different
and
tonalities. Yeah,
it is. And one of the things that's so important, this is what the King James Version does well. This is a poem, so to speak, and so it expresses it poetically. And Hebrew poetry is written differently than English poetry is. So but one of the key features that go along everywhere is assonance, alliteration, and rhythm. And those are the things, and it's that rhythm that I think is extremely important. It's also the point that Tennant makes in his work, that you make yourself known. He calls it rhythmic traversing, so that you can say the third dimensional creature, it's kind of like in the pulsing of passing the sphere through the plane, that you see the circle going, woo, woo. It's very science fiction-like. But somebody goes, wait a minute, there's this other thing going on that we don't know anything about. And I don't know how to explain it to you, Mr. Square. I don't even know that you're a square. To me, you're just a line, So, so that's that kind of. No, anyway, that was just a couple of side notes.
So Zen and the Unspeakable God, according to Google, it's Jason N. Bloom.
Bloom, yes. Yes.
Yes.
Sounds intriguing.
Yes, and it's a very thin book. The first chapter is why. Just I'm pretty sure it was a reference that Kripal mentioned. The problem of context and interpretive approach, and then he goes through it's Hui Neng is the third one, and then this conclusion, theory and interpretation. This also fits in. This dovetails beautifully with the whole Carney discussion and his take on hermeneutics and our need to interpret. I see, Carney, Kripal, Bloom fits into that entire, a dimension of kind of like what we're doing that is important, and it actually is playing a role in the integral literature discussion that Andrew's kind of fielding over any other thread as well.
this is another book that I think would complement the one you've just described. Do you know this one?
Yeah, you're talking about, I don't know it. No. Okay.
He's Ibn Arabi, Plotinus, Marguerite Perret, Eckhart. It's a fascinating read, and it's a kind of postmodern approach in a way. But I think he's looking at all these overlaps in the monotheistic tradition.
Yeah. I'll tell you, not to be dismissive. I don't want to be dismissive or anything. Like I sometimes can get. I don't mean it that way, but I have a real problem with anybody that has this postmodern approach, because I get lost and confused too quickly. Well, the thing that I liked about this book, it was kind of like a return to the roots for me. It was like somebody said, okay, we're going to sit down and how do we make sense of this? And sense actually, and meaning took on a greater role. I'm not saying that they don't play that or don't have that in postmodernism. I just have a hard time finding it sometimes.
Yeah, I so agree. And I think the way Michael Sells is using, he's looking at the Gnostic voices of Marguerite Perret, who was burned at the stake in the 13th century, I think, and Eckhart, who almost was burned at the stake, but he died first before
and
so he's looking at Ibn Arabi, and he's looking at what he's calling these Gnostic voices, which were heretical in the traditions, that they were members of a certain tradition. And I think that's something that is resurfacing. And I think in the postmodern, we hear a lot of Gnostic voices that were suppressed and repressed. And the healthy side of the postmodern is an attempt at pluralism.
Yes.
And I think it has turned into the Tower of Babel, unfortunately. But I think there are some persons like have been misrepresented as just flying by the seat of their pants, just all relative. And like Foucault, I don't think can be branded as just a relativist. And I think a lot of those thinkers were thinking really hard about how do you have pluralism when this authoritarian fascist stamp is being put in every place. It's, these people had escaped from Nazi Germany, they had just gotten over the Second World War. So I think this is the challenge for us, is how do we go into a reconstructive phase after all this deconstruction happened. And queer theory comes out of deconstruction.
Because I must be reading different postmodern literature than you guys, because mostly I like postmodern literature, what I've read of it, but maybe I'm not reading the same stuff as you guys.
I'm listening to this, The Tunnel. This is supposed to be a classic postmodern novel by William Gass. It's fascinating. I love the way it sounds. And I'm reading the text along with it. But I think these are I know that Doug has already left, and I guess we're getting to the top of the hour. But I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm really grateful to everyone for the quality of attention that you've been bringing to this. And you've given me so much to think about. But I definitely think that what I'm taking from Vint, and I'm glad you're reading that, that language, that if we share a language, our minds are entangled. Our bodies may not be entangled, but our language does entangle our minds. I think that's
one of the interesting things about the Vent is that this was brought to my attention. I mean, you brought it to my attention, Johnny, but then this colleague of mine who works in social science asked to meet with me so I could explain quantum entanglement to her, because she was looking at whether or not the idea could be introduced into some of her work in social science. And I hadn't read Wendt at the time so I spent a week scrabbling around trying to find as much, because I know quantum entanglement, but it's a bit complicated and subtle to read through, so I wanted to be bone up on the issues so that at least I could talk about it intelligently with her. And that led me back into the Wendt again, which is actually maybe more what she was looking at for than I could provide, but.
Sounds good. we have all kinds of research projects coming up out of this, because I think Wint and Karen Barad and a lot of physicists who are thinking about our social worlds. And I know Andrew Field had expressed some doubt about this and how it could be reductive move. And I realize that it's a possibility, but I think we're moving out of this classical worldview. And
Well,
it's hard to do. It's
I
hard
wanted to come back to the Nora Bateson. So, because when she talks about warm data, you mentioned it, Johnny, it's a distinction from big data. And what is big data? But it's context-free data, because it's massive amounts of data for which nobody has the attention to pay to the context in which it was acquired. So context is dumped, and then you try and pull patterns out of the result, which is tricky. Nora's idea of warm data is in this trans-contextual stuff that she talks about. So it's context-driven, but context-driven across disciplines, so, across contexts, right? So that you drag the context with you to the next context. And that's what you're looking at with warm data. And I think this is very close to both this interreligion discussion that we're having, where you want to move from one religion understanding of something to another religion without throwing out the first one when you do this process, right? Which is typically what's done. And also the Gebserian context, which is also context dependent, right? So I think the Nora Bateson ideas are very, very pertinent to this.
Yep, I do too. Another Gnostic voice. I guess we're time is almost up. I've been very satisfied by this conversation. I'm looking forward to looking at the recording when it comes out, because I'm sure there are a lot of things that I missed in the moment while we're speaking, and I'm really curious about all the patterns and meta patterns that might be operating outside of our awareness, but that can be captured in the archive. And so I love this interplay of like the speaking in a sort of soccer game that we're doing here, bouncing that ball around, and the rhythm, and then the reflective capacity when we if you have an opportunity to review a video, you start to realize, oh, I didn't know that was going on. There was an undercurrent, there was a wave, and diffracted, many different waves. And I think that's where the quantum bit is very suggestive. And I think this is what Karen Barad and Andrew Venter are playing with. And I think that's really fascinating. So anyway, thank you all very much. I don't know if Ed has any summary remarks to make, any appreciations. Thank you.
No, I'm good. I said what I had to say, and I enjoyed the talk.
Me too, an enjoyable conversation, an enjoyable afternoon. I'm going to get back to my sewing now.
Do that.
I want to see you run this down the runway when you get this garment designed. Thank you all.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
good luck. Take care.
See you next time.